Pine Creek looked like the kind of place that came printed on postcards. The lawns were trimmed with military precision. The sidewalks gleamed under the morning sun, and every mailbox stood straight as a soldier. It was the kind of neighborhood where nothing ever seemed out of place, where neighbors waved but didn't pry, and the silence on the cul-de-sac wasn't eerie. It was enforced. For Dan Whitaker, a retired engineer who'd spent 3 decades working on offshore oil rigs and power plants, Pine Creek was supposed to be his slice of peace. After years of noise, chaos, and the unpredictable rhythm of the sea, this place offered routine, predictability, quiet. Dan had moved in just 3 months ago, trading in his ocean blue view for the pastel comfort of suburbia. The house was modest, but well kept, and his workshop in the garage was already shaping into his favorite spot. Every morning he'd sit on the front porch with a mug of black coffee, watching the world go by. Or rather, watching it stay perfectly still. That's what caught his attention in the first place, how unnaturally still everything was. No kids riding bikes, no dogs barking. Even the wind chimes barely dared to sing. From the moment Dan unpacked his first box, the HOA made its presence unknown. A welcome to Pine Creek packet had been waiting on his doorstep. 36 pages of rules, guidelines, and expectations. The grass must never exceed 2 inches. Trash bins were to be brought in no later than 10 a.m. after pickup. No visible garden gnomes, no hanging laundry, and certainly no vehicles parked on the street overnight. The letter was signed by Karen, Monsieur Sullivan, Vice President, Pine Creek HOA, in a bold, looping script that practically oozed superiority. At first, Dan didn't mind. Rules were rules, and he'd always been the kind of man who followed them. But there was something about Pine Creek that began to itch under his skin. It started small. One morning he noticed his hose had been uncoiled and left across the lawn. He assumed he'd forgotten to roll it up. Then it happened again, and again. A couple of tools vanished from his open garage. Not expensive ones, just odd bits. A wrench, a nozzle. Nothing worth calling the cops over, but enough to make him pause. Neighbors were polite but distant. He'd wave, they'd nod. He tried. Small talk with the man across the street. Tall guy, always washing his car. But the conversation ended with a tight-lipped smile and a, "We don't really get involved with HOA matters." That line stuck with him. Then there was Karen. She had that look, the kind of woman who had memorized every rule and wrote new ones just for fun. Her yard was immaculate, her flowers arranged in perfect color-coded beds, and her little white dog barked like it owned the place. Dan had seen her walking past his driveway at least twice a day, always slowing near his garage, always watching. He couldn't put his finger on it, but Pine Creek didn't feel like home. Not yet. There was a strange undercurrent beneath the perfection, like a song playing just out of tune. Dan didn't know it yet, but he was about to find out that in Pine Creek, the quiet was a cover, and behind the pristine hedges and freshly painted fences, something rotten was brewing. And it all started with a hose. Hey, real quick, if you're enjoying the video so far, make sure to hit that like button, share it with friends, and subscribe for more awesome content. And while you're at it, drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from. All right, let's keep going. The first time Dan noticed the spike in his water bill, he chalked it up to lawn care. It was early spring, and he'd started watering the front yard a little more to wake the grass up from its winter nap. But when the second bill came in, nearly double the first, his brow furrowed. He hadn't filled a pool, hadn't power washed the house, and the sprinklers only ran twice a week. It didn't make sense. Curious, Dan started keeping track. He jotted down the meter, reading one night before bed, and again first thing in the morning. The numbers were creeping up, even when he wasn't using a drop. At first he figured it had to be something simple. Maybe a leaky faucet. Maybe one of the outdoor spigots wasn't sealed, right? He checked every sink, toilet, pipe, and hose connection. Everything looked fine. Still, something felt off. One morning, Dan stepped outside to grab the newspaper and noticed the garden hose stretched across the lawn, uncoiled, damp, and trailing faint lines in the dew-covered grass like it had been dragged. He stared at it for a long moment, mug of coffee halfway to his lips. He hadn't touched the hose in 3 days. He picked it up and gave it a tug. The end was slightly muddy, the nozzle dripping as if it had just been used. He ran water through it and sniffed. Clean. No weird odors. He squinted at the neighbors' yards, immaculate as always. Karen's. Roses looked unusually fresh for early spring, their petals glistening in the sun like they'd been watered recently. Her lawn, already greener than most, looked practically photoshopped. Dan shook his head. He didn't want to jump to conclusions. Maybe he was being paranoid. Maybe some kid thought it was funny to mess with his stuff. Maybe it was an animal. The possibilities, while thin, kept his doubt alive enough to keep him quiet. But as the days passed, the hose kept reappearing in different places, once near the driveway, once rolled out all the way to the sidewalk like someone had dragged it as far as it would go. Still trying to stay logical, Dan went back to the plumbing theory. He called in a local handyman, who did a full inspection. No visible leaks, no pressure issues, no underground pipe ruptures. Everything checked out. The handyman had shrugged, taken his $50, and suggested keeping an eye on neighborhood kids playing tricks. But Dan had seen no kids, not one, not since he moved in. Then came the third bill. It arrived in a stiff white envelope, and when Dan tore it open, his eyes widened. It was nearly triple what he used to pay at his last house, more than what a single person with no pool and minimal gardening should ever be charged. His jaw clenched. This wasn't coincidence anymore. Something, or someone, was using his water. That night, as he lay in bed staring at the ceiling, a thought wormed its way into his mind and stayed there like a splinter. What if someone's stealing it? It seemed ridiculous, even childish. Who would sneak onto someone's property to use a hose? But something about Pine Creek, its sterile perfection, its unspoken rules, its people with those tight-lipped smiles, made Dan wonder if he was really the only one noticing things didn't quite add up. He didn't have proof yet, but his instincts had kicked in, and Dan had learned a long time ago, when your gut tells you something's wrong, it usually is. Dan wasn't the kind of man to jump to conclusions, but he was also no fool. After weeks of watching the numbers on his water meter tick up while his hose wandered around the yard like it had a mind of its own, he decided it was time for answers, and the only way to get them was with cold, hard proof. He ordered a small outdoor security camera, one of those discreet ones with night vision and motion detection. He mounted it quietly under the eaves, pointing it straight at the side yard, where the spigot was. He didn't tell a soul. For 2 nights, nothing happened. The hose stayed coiled, the grass dry, the camera blinking silently in standby. But on the 3rd night, at exactly 2:43 a.m., the motion sensor tripped. Dan reviewed the footage in the morning, coffee in hand and heart pounding with anticipation. The screen lit up with grainy night vision video, and there she was, a silhouette slipping into his yard like a ghost, carrying a small bucket and dragging something behind her. As she moved closer to the hose, the night vision caught her face, in full detail. Karen. Wearing a pink bathrobe and slippers, her signature platinum bob tucked behind her ears, she crouched like she'd done this 100 times. Dan watched, stunned, as she twisted the spigot open, ran the hose across the street to her own yard, and began watering her hydrangeas like it was the most natural thing in the world. And when that was done, she walked over to her pristine white Lexus and began rinsing it off, scrubbing the hood with a sponge from her bucket. Water flowed freely across his lawn and down the storm drain. Dan leaned back in his chair, lips pressed, in a tight line. There it was. Proof. The vice president of the HOA, trespassing on his property in the dead of night, stealing his water to polish her car and keep her garden perfect. The very same woman, who sent him passive-aggressive letters about trash bins visible from the street. He waited until dusk before confronting her. Karen was in her driveway, pruning her rose bushes with delicate little scissors, the white dog yapping from the porch. "Evening, Karen," Dan said, approaching slowly. She turned, smiled like a cat in a birdcage. "Oh, hi, Dan. Everything okay?" "I was going to ask you the same," he replied, his tone neutral but edged. "Because last night, you were in my yard, using my hose." Karen's smile didn't falter. In fact, it sharpened. "Excuse me? I've got it on camera," Dan said simply, pulling out his phone and holding it up. Not playing the footage yet, just letting the threat hang. Karen's expression shifted just slightly, the tiniest flicker of irritation breaking through. "Dan, if you're going to accuse your neighbors of something as ridiculous as water theft, maybe you should reread the HOA guidelines," she said crisply. "Section 5.1 grants communal access to outdoor utilities for neighborhood maintenance purposes." Dan blinked. "You're calling washing your Lexus neighborhood maintenance?" She crossed her arms. "Don't be dramatic. It's just water. And you're retired. You don't even use that much. Maybe you should focus on keeping your grass within regulation height before accusing me of anything." And with that, she turned and walked away, scissors snipping, roses falling. Dan stood there stunned. No apology, no shame, just rules twisted like a noose. She didn't care that she'd been caught, because in her mind she was untouchable. But Karen had made one mistake. She underestimated the man behind the hose. It started small at first, just a slip of paper stuck to his front door. Dan thought it was another flyer, maybe some new neighborhood event he hadn't bothered to read about. But when he unfolded it, the sharp edge of anxiety cut through him like a knife. The paper was an official HOA violation notice. Violation: improper lawn maintenance. The violation claimed his grass was half an inch too tall, something about Section 7.4 of HOA guidelines that he'd never actually noticed before. Dan frowned and checked his front yard. The grass was well within regulation. He knew it. He measured it. But the notice was printed in bold official letters, complete with a fine of $50 if not corrected within 48 hours. He stared at the paper, his pulse picking up. It was the first of many. In the coming weeks, the notices kept coming, each one more ridiculous than the last. Hose left unrolled. Mailbox not properly aligned. Trash cans visible from the street. At first, Dan thought maybe there was some mix-up. Maybe the HOA had made a mistake. After all, he knew he had his trash cans in order. His mailbox was fine, and he certainly didn't leave his hose out in the open. But every time he corrected one issue, another one seemed to appear. His mailbox, now misaligned. His garden, deemed out of season. His trees, too tall for proper curb visibility. And almost every time the notice was signed with Karen's name, bold and unapologetic. But it wasn't just the violations that made Dan's stomach twist. It was the way Karen seemed to appear at his doorstep the very moment the notice was issued, acting all sweet and concerned, as if she hadn't been the one to write it. "Oh, Dan, I just wanted to make sure you got the latest notice. It's so important to follow the rules, don't you think?" she'd say, giving him one of those fake smiles that barely reached her eyes. Each time Dan was caught in a battle of logic and frustration, trying to explain himself, but Karen just smiled and nodded, acting like he was the one being unreasonable. "It's all part of the rules, Dan. We've all got to play by them," she would say, then walk off, leaving him standing there, more confused and irritated than before. The worst part was when the HOA board stepped in. A meeting was called, and Dan, expecting some form of support, sat in the cramped room with the board members, his frustration growing. He'd tried to explain what had been happening, how he was being harassed with notice after notice, and how his lawn was fine, his house was fine. But the board only nodded sympathetically and looked to Karen for guidance. The president of the HOA, a tight-lipped woman named Helen, turned to him with a practiced smile. "Well, Dan, It seems you've received multiple violations that we simply can't overlook. The community rules are in place for a reason, and we're all bound by them. You've been given plenty of time to fix things, and Karen is just doing her job." Dan tried to argue, but it was like speaking into a void. The board members barely listened, too wrapped up in their blind adherence to the rules to even acknowledge the possibility of mistakes. Every violation was dismissed, every plea ignored. Karen's influence over the board was too strong, too ingrained. It hit him all at once. This wasn't just about a hose. This wasn't just petty neighborhood politics. Karen had power. She didn't just want to control his water. She wanted to control him, to put him in his place, and she had the HOA wrapped around her finger. Dan had seen manipulation before, in meetings, in office politics, in power struggles. But this was different. This was personal. And she was using the HOA to play a dangerous game, one where the rules didn't apply to her, and Dan was just another pawn to be moved around and discarded when necessary. The tension gnawed at him, a slow burn in the pit of his stomach. This was no longer just a feud over a hose. This was a battle for control, and the stakes were higher than he ever expected. The mornings had become unbearable. Dan's blood pressure spiked every time he stepped outside. The unrelenting sound of his water meter turning, its mechanical click, 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 had become a daily reminder that something was horribly wrong. He was no longer just hearing the noise in the back of his mind. It was inescapable. It was taunting him, a constant reminder of the theft that had gone unnoticed, unpunished. But things were about to get worse. Much worse. One early morning, as Dan was enjoying his coffee on the porch, he noticed something different. The yard looked exactly the same, perfectly manicured, grass trimmed, flowers still bending toward the sun. But something was off. The hose was stretched out, but it wasn't in the usual place. It had been dragged all the way across his front yard to a spot near his fence. The spigot was wide open. He squinted, unsure of what he was seeing. Then it hit him. A splitter had been attached to the hose. And it wasn't just attached. It was locked in place, the nozzle firmly secured with a heavy-duty clamp. Someone had gone to the trouble of fixing it there, making sure the water would flow without interruption. Dan's stomach twisted as he realized what this meant. Karen had gone full throttle. Dan rushed to the spigot, his pulse pounding in his ears, and twisted the valve. Sure enough, water poured from the hose, a steady stream, across his lawn and into her yard. No more sneaky, late-night visits. No more subtle garden watering. Karen was stealing from him openly, shamelessly. She'd taken control of his water supply as if it were her right. The fury built up inside him, a slow burn that started in his chest and exploded in his head. This was no longer about a neighborly squabble over a hose. This was theft. This was an invasion of his personal space, his home. Dan immediately called the HOA office, barely keeping his voice steady. "I've caught someone using my water. I've installed a camera, and I've got proof. The water's being stolen right out of my yard, and the spigot has been tampered with. I need this fixed." He was met with the usual calm, condescending tone on the other end. "I understand your frustration, Dan, but you must understand that tampering with community utilities is a serious violation." Dan froze. "What?" "Yes, we've reviewed your report. According to Section 3.7, you're in violation for tampering with a community resource. You'll be fined for misuse of HOA infrastructure. Your actions are not in compliance." And I stared at the phone, disbelief settling in. Tampering with community utilities? He had done nothing but try to protect his property, and now the HOA was siding with Karen. Again. They weren't concerned with the fact that she was literally stealing his water. They were only concerned with covering up her actions by punishing him. He slammed the phone down, a flood of rage sweeping over him. The truth hit him hard in the gut. The HOA wasn't on his side. Not now, not ever. They were more interested in preserving their fragile system of control than in stopping Karen's blatant abuse. Dan stood in his yard, staring at the hose, now stretching further into Karen's pristine landscape. It was an invasion of his privacy, an invasion of his peace. And no one would stop her. This was war. He didn't know how, but he knew one thing for sure. If no one was going to help him, then he'd have to take matters into his own hands. Karen had pushed too far, and now, Dan was going to push back. Dan stood at the edge of his yard, staring at the hose that had been his enemy for far too long. The sight of it, the unwelcome tool that Karen had used to invade his property, suddenly filled him with a dark sense of satisfaction. It was time for payback, and Dan wasn't going to let her get away with it any longer. He was an engineer by trade, and his mind worked differently than most. Where some might have been content to report her to the authorities or continue fighting a losing battle with the HOA, Dan knew that the best way to beat Karen at her own game was to think outside the box. He needed a plan, something she wouldn't see coming, something that would make her regret ever touching his hose. The answer came to him slowly over the course of a sleepless night. It had to be brilliant, simple, effective, and untraceable. He remembered the sewage tank that sat behind his garage. It was meant for the RV he kept parked on his property, a large, reliable system that processed waste from his vehicle. The tank wasn't used often, but it was functional and, more importantly, it was connected to the same water system. What if he could reroute the hose? His heart raced with the idea, a wild grin tugging at the corners of his mouth. This wasn't about just getting even. It was about sending a message, a clear, unmistakable message. By the time the sun began to rise, Dan had already begun his work. He walked out into his backyard, carrying a set of tools, and set to work with the precision of someone who'd spent years fixing and building. His hands moved quickly, his mind calculating every step. The hose he had once relied on for gardening now became his instrument of revenge. He unscrewed the nozzle and rerouted the connection, attaching it firmly to the sewage tank's output valve. The system was simple. Once the valve was opened, water would flow through the hose, but not the kind of water anyone would want in their garden. Dan adjusted the pressure, made sure everything was secure, and then stepped back. He couldn't help but feel a strange satisfaction. It was like he was finally taking control again. He spent the rest of the day keeping himself busy, trying to ignore the anxious excitement bubbling up inside him. The waiting was almost unbearable, but patience was key. He knew Karen's routine. She was always out in her garden early, inspecting every flower and shrub with a critical eye, ensuring everything was perfect. That evening, as the sun dipped, below the horizon, Dan sat on his porch, watching the shadows stretch across the neighborhood. His eyes flickered over to Karen's house, where the lights were on. He knew she'd be coming outside soon. Sure enough, about an hour later, he saw her through the window, moving toward the front yard. Dan held his breath as she appeared, stepping confidently toward the spigot. She didn't even hesitate, thinking the hose was just as it always had been. She twisted the valve, and the familiar sound of water rushing through the line began. Then, the unmistakable sound of a loud splat filled the air. The hose, once a tool of convenience, now released its dirty payload into Karen's carefully manicured garden. Thick, foul-smelling water sprayed across her flower beds, soaking everything in its path. It was a nasty, putrid mess, raw sewage, the kind that no one would want in their yard, let alone their flowers. Karen froze. Her hand still clutched the nozzle, but the smile on her face quickly faded.
She looked down, confused, her eyes widening in horror as she realized what was happening. The water wasn't clear. It was thick, dark, and slimy. Her fingers fumbled with the hose, but it was no use. It was already too late. The damage had been done, and then it happened. Karen screamed.
The shrill, high-pitched shriek echoed through the neighborhood, startling the birds from their nests. She yanked the hose from the spigot, but it was as if the entire yard had been hit by a flood of filth. It drenched her clothes, her hands, her shoes, everything. Her garden was ruined. But the worst part, the sewage was now all over her. She looked like she'd just stepped into a nightmare, her perfectly groomed appearance shattered. The neighbors began to gather, peeking through windows and stepping out onto their porches. Dan's heart pounded in his chest as he watched the chaos unfold. He didn't want to be caught staring, but he couldn't help it. The scene was almost too perfect. Karen stood there, covered in sludge, utterly mortified. She sputtered, wiped at her face with one hand, and screamed again, this time in fury, not fear. "What the hell is this?" she shouted, shaking her fist at the sky. But no one was on her side. No one cared. The HOA had already abandoned her, and now the neighbors, who had once feared her, were just watching, some even starting to laugh at the sight of their former queen reduced to this. Dan could hardly contain the grin on his face. He'd done. He'd taken back control in the most fitting way possible. And now, Karen would never forget it. He stepped back into his house, watching the spectacle from the window, feeling a strange mix of satisfaction and power. It was over. She had finally been served a taste of her own medicine. The morning after her humiliation, Karen was a whirlwind of fury. Dan could practically feel the heat of her anger radiating from her front yard as he sipped his coffee, watching her storm around her porch, glaring at her ruined garden. He hadn't been able to stop smiling since he'd pulled off the ultimate. Revenge. But that smile faded quickly as he saw her on the phone, her gestures sharp and frantic. She was making calls, most likely to the HOA, her lifeline in a neighborhood she had dominated for so long. It didn't take long before the first ominous notice arrived. An emergency HOA meeting had been called. The envelope, stamped in bold, red, landed with a thud on Dan's doorstep, a reminder that the storm was far from over. Inside, a formal request demanded his attendance, along with an explanation for the disruption to community harmony. Dan wasn't concerned. He'd expected this, but what followed took him by surprise. The next day, Karen stood in front of the HOA board, her usual self-righteousness replaced by barely contained rage. "This man," she said, pointing a trembling finger toward Dan, "is a criminal. He sabotaged my garden, he attacked me, and now he's tampered with community property in a way I never could have imagined." Her voice was shrill, her eyes red with fury. But she had one thing on her side, her dramatic flair. The HOA members listened, nodding sympathetically as she spun her tale. She painted herself as the victim, the poor woman who had been unjustly harmed by Dan's underhanded scheme. The mere thought of him getting away with what she called a vile act of vengeance seemed to appall her. "I demand a $5,000 fine, and I want him evicted from this community," Karen shouted, her hand slamming against the table for emphasis. "He can't just walk around with zero consequences. This is an assault on our neighborhood." Dan sat quietly, his arms crossed, letting her words wash over him. He had expected this level of drama, but what she didn't know was that he had come prepared. He stood up slowly, his voice calm but firm. "Before we go any further, let's take a look at the facts," he said, pulling out his phone. "I have video footage of Karen using my hose several times. I also have plumbing records that show my water usage has been consistent until she started tapping into my spigot. And, just for good measure, I brought a local reporter along." The room fell silent. Karen's eyes widened as Dan gestured toward a woman sitting at the back of the room, a notepad in hand. It was Sarah Jenkins, a local investigative reporter, known for her work uncovering corruption in HOA-run communities. Dan had contacted her days before, sensing that the board wouldn't be on his side, and now she was here to report the truth. Sarah stood up, her eyes scanning the room, her voice cool and professional. I've been investigating this HOA for a few months now. There have been rumors of corruption and unethical practices, particularly with regard to the way they handle complaints and fines. Mr. Thompson here, she gestured to Dan, reached out to me after his complaints about harassment and theft were ignored. The HOA board members shifted uncomfortably. They weren't used to having their dirty laundry aired in public, and now they were facing the very real possibility that the neighborhood's most vocal advocate for order might be the one with the most to hide. Karen's face flushed crimson, her chest rising and falling with anger. She opened her mouth to speak, but the words caught in her throat. She could feel the tide shifting beneath her feet, the once sturdy foundation of her power in the neighborhood crumbling away with each passing second. Dan, seizing the opportunity, continued. Karen has been using my hose for weeks. I have proof. And the only reason she's here today trying to have me fined and evicted is because she knows she's been caught. She was stealing my water, and when she couldn't get away with it anymore, she tried to turn the tables. The HOA president, Helen, shifted in her seat, finally speaking up. We will need to review this evidence before making any decisions, but I think we can all agree that this situation needs to be resolved quickly. And just like that, the tables had turned. Karen, the once feared HOA vice president, now found herself backed into a corner with no way out. The room buzzed with whispered conversations, and the other board members, those who had once nodded in agreement with Karen's every word, now looked at her with a mix of doubt and distrust. One by one, the neighbors began to speak up, their voices trembling with newfound confidence. They had always been afraid to cross Karen, but now, in the face of undeniable evidence, they were emboldened. I've seen her sneaking around late at night, one neighbor said. I thought it was odd, but now it makes sense. I never wanted to get involved, but I've had enough, another neighbor added. It's about time someone stood up to her. As the meeting continued, Karen's once unshakable grip on the neighborhood slipped further and further away. The truth was out now, and there was no going back. Dan watched as Karen's smugness melted away, replaced by a look of sheer panic. This was the moment he'd been waiting for. And as the fallout continued, he knew one thing for certain. The neighborhood was no longer Karen's to control. It was his. The days that followed the HOA meeting felt like a strange dream to Dan. Karen's once unshakable control over the neighborhood had crumbled almost overnight. The community, which had been silent for so long, was now full of whispers, but they weren't about him anymore. The tide had turned, and all eyes were on Karen. The HOA board met again, this time without her. Karen had been swiftly voted off, her power stripped away as quickly as it had been built. Helen, the HOA president, who had always been passive in Karen's shadow, now found herself in a position of authority. But it wasn't the newfound power that kept her awake at night. It was the pile of evidence that Dan had handed over. The video footage, the plumbing records, the reports from the local reporter Sarah, who had been a thorn in the HOA's side for weeks. But it was the investigation into Karen's financial dealings that really shocked everyone. A full-scale investigation revealed that Karen had been using HOA funds for her personal landscaping projects. The HOA money, intended to maintain communal spaces, had been funneled into her own backyard, a clear violation of the community's trust. But the betrayal didn't stop there. Karen was also discovered to have stolen water from multiple homes, not just Dan's. She'd been siphoning off neighbors' hoses, taking what wasn't hers without a second thought. It was a web of theft and deceit that no one had suspected, until it all unraveled so spectacularly. The fallout was swift and unforgiving. Karen was slapped with fines, the magnitude of which left her gasping. The HOA was no longer the safe haven for her schemes. There was talk of legal action, and though the law was slow to move, the truth was undeniable. Karen had crossed many lines, and now she was facing the consequences. But for Dan, the sweet taste of justice wasn't in the legalities or the fines. It was in the small, quiet moments that followed. It was the sight of his backyard, once a battleground, now peaceful and serene. The hose that had been the instrument of so much frustration and anger was no longer a threat, nor a tool for someone else's misuse. He had installed a keypad lock on the spigot, a simple but effective solution that only he could access. The lock wasn't about being petty, it was about ensuring that his space remained his. The water in his yard would now flow only when he decided it would. His fingers hovered over the keypad, a small, triumphant smile playing on his lips. There would be no more surprise visits from Karen, no more stolen water. Just peace. Dan spent his days enjoying his garden, working on the projects he'd put off for so long. The plants thrived without the threat of being doused with sewage, and the sound of the wind rustling through the trees replaced the stress that used to fill his mind. He'd earned this quiet, this freedom from the chaos that had once ruled his life. And then, one afternoon, as he sat on his porch, his phone buzzed. He checked it, and for the first time in weeks, he felt his heart skip a beat. Not because of Karen, but because of something even more satisfying. It was a message from one of his neighbors, Mark, who had been a quiet ally throughout the whole ordeal. "You wouldn't believe this," Mark wrote. "Karen just came by to apologize. She's embarrassed, and it looks like the whole neighborhood is turning against her. She even said she was sorry for the misunderstanding." Can you believe that? Dan chuckled to himself. The thought of Karen, the once feared HOA vice president, coming to him for forgiveness was both absurd and sweet. But that wasn't the end of it. A few days later, Karen herself showed up at his doorstep. She stood there, her face pale and drawn, her eyes avoiding his as she spoke. I wanted to apologize," she said, her voice thin. "I let things get out of hand. I didn't realize how much I was affecting everyone." Dan raised an eyebrow, crossing his arms. He wasn't sure what to make of this sudden shift in Karen's demeanor. He had expected defiance, not remorse. But the apology, however reluctant, was still an apology. It was a small victory in its own right. "I appreciate you saying that," he said, his tone polite but firm. "But it's not just about the hose or the water. It's about how you treated everyone, how you used your power to control and manipulate people for your own gain. That's not something you can just apologize for." Karen nodded, her gaze dropping to the ground. She looked defeated, and Dan could see it in her eyes, the realization that her reign of terror was truly over. The apology, though small, was a necessary part of her downfall, and it gave him a sense of closure. Dan stood there, watching her turn and walk away. The moment felt surreal. The Karen who had once made his life a nightmare was now nothing more than a shadow of her former self, humbled and broken. As he returned to his porch, the neighbors, who had been watching from their windows, came out to offer their congratulations. They had seen it all unfold, and they knew that justice had been served. Dan had done what no one else had the courage to do. He had fought back, and he had won. As the sun dipped behind the trees, casting a warm golden light across the neighborhood, Dan chuckled to himself. The world had a funny way of righting itself, and sometimes sewage really did clean things out. "Guess sewage really cleans things out," he murmured with a grin, leaning back in his chair and taking a deep breath. The air smelled sweeter now, more peaceful. For the first time in months, Dan felt like he could finally relax, like the neighborhood had returned to what it was meant to be, a place of calm, not conflict, and for once, the only thing that mattered
was the quiet. If you enjoyed this video and want to see the next part, let me know in the comments. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to stay updated. See you in the next one. Your support means the world.